All right, well, let's get started. So I want to welcome the VA.gov team. I've talked to them before. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to them in the past. They've done a lot of work on making static sites, and I've been very impressed with their journey. They've come a long way, and maybe I'm venturing too far, but I think it's one of the largest static sites out there for Drupal, and maybe even one of the larger Drupal sites out there for serving the number of people that they're doing and the number of editors and things like that. The way they're using Tome is just amazing. Last I had heard, they were getting sub-second performance build times out of it. So that just blew me away. Is that how do you get sub-second build time? So maybe you guys can start us off and well, just go around and do the introductions and just take it away. Let's just go through here in the order we've listed here. So Sam, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi there, I'm Sam Mortenson. I maintain a ton of Drupal projects, mostly modules, and I also created Tome, which is a static site generator for Drupal. So I'm kind of sitting in to answer any technical questions or Tome-related questions that might come up. Thanks for having me.
Hey folks, I'm Robbie Holmes. I'm the VP of Product Development at a company called Pluribus Digital. I was a member of the United States Digital Service, and I was the technical product owner for the content management system behind VA.gov up until last March when my tour of duty ended. So I was also an early member of the vets.gov team, which was the precursor to what is currently on VA.gov. There's a big brand merger that ended up happening, and I'm sure we will get into that a little bit. I'm real happy to be here. It's good people.
Hi there, Neil Hastings. I'm the core tech team lead. We have multiple teams on our CMS team. So I'm the core team lead. I actually joined around February last year, so I've been here about a year. On our team, we do a lot of the platform level stuff, the DevOps pieces of it. And Elijah on here. He's our DevOps lead. But he's not on this call. I was trying to get him on here too, but he's not able to join today. And introduction was about sub-second performance and stuff. That's setting some high expectations. We'll get some real information of what actually happens and some of the challenges, especially around working with government projects. It's very exciting stuff though, so I won't go too deep now. Steve.
Hey everybody, I'm Steve Wirt. I'm in Venice, Florida. I'm the product team tech lead, and I've been on the VA.gov project for almost 2 years now, I think, coming up on that anyway. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to work on the project, but it also has a lot of ups and downs, which are, they're fun to solve and fun to figure out, and for a good cause, and enjoy that aspect of it.
Well, it's great to have you guys here. So thank you for coming on the show here. So thank you. Let me stop my screen share here. So you wanna start us off, Neil, with
yeah,
with the size of the projects and everything.
Absolutely. So I was going to start, and I actually realized as of this morning that I actually had access to Google Analytics. So I figured I can share Google Analytics. And so what interesting about our projects is this is actually all of VA.gov, which is a little more than just the sites that we publish. But so this is the front end experience with the static sites. This is over about over a month. And as you see, these are page views. So as you see, we get 4 or 5 million pages in a day is not unexpected. 6 million pages on really busy. Actually, we haven't quite hit those. So it's a very, very high traffic experience. A lot of these I went and tried to break down and figure out what is actually like what different things. And we have a whole. This kind of includes some of the benefits information. So the VA will go get their benefits hub information out of this, and which is a different Rails experience. They will. This includes like all veterans information. So like for example, where they can go get COVID vaccinations, where they can go get tested. It includes information about health facilities, how to get there. You know, there's just a huge amount of information serving all of our veterans here, and it's as you see a high traffic site. We have a lot of new users a day. And look at the number of users to new users. So it's a lot of unique users, and this is all right now served from AWS static S3 bucket. Sort of. So it's a little complicated how the architecture works. But the actual HTML pages are sitting on a bucket. There's actually a couple layers in front of it that the VA.gov manages. And Robbie might know more details about some of the deep dark corners of VA IT that I know. But yeah, so it's a lot. I just see a lot of usage. I kind of wanted to kind of focus in a little bit on our deploy architecture. Oops, let me get the right diagram. Here we go. This is, can you see that okay? Is that large enough?
You can go up a little bit. Yeah, that's great.
So, and this is kind of live. This is kind of a little janky, but the deploying code, going from Drupal and going to, I want to actually talk about editorial. So currently we have about, I think 180 live editor accounts in our system. Not all those are super active, but we have that many editors. We plan on, I've heard rumors, and Steve might be able to corroborate this. I've heard rumors of like 1,000 by the end of the year, 1,000 simultaneous editors working on our system. And we expect maybe 100, 200 simultaneous users given that. But like, so very high traffic, even on the editorial side coming in for us. And this scares the heck out of me right now. So, Steve, is that right, Steve, that you heard those rumors too? They're rumors right now.
I think that's accurate. We're expecting over 1,000 editors by the time where everything's migrated to the CMS.
We're right now in the huge growth piece. We're bringing new Vue facilities, migrating from old team sites to Drupal. It's funny because it's still a static site generation tool. From one static site generation tool to another static site generation tool, because team sites is a publishing tool. So basically, what's interesting is actually different teams within the VA that handle the different aspects. So Steve and I are on the CMS side. So we actually handle all the Drupal side of it. And one thing you'll hear about working with government is your scope of work ends at the contract. So not necessarily the technical, your boundaries of what you do end at the contracts. So even within, so there, and Robbie can definitely knows more about this than I do. So we have multiple contracts that actually manage the project, and this whole build process is on at least 3 different contracts. So there is a generation of the data, which is what our contract is about. And I say that because it's very important, because I've tried reaching across contracts to get things done, and it doesn't always go very well. There's the actual build of the static HTML is a different contract, different group of people, and the operations piece behind it, between moving the data around, the server administration, we use AWS for everything. That's another contract of people. So a lot of the complication we have is on these boundaries. How do we deliver between each? Because the editors and the end users don't care about that. They just want their sites live. So that's always been a big struggle, especially right now as we're trying to scale up and figure out our weak points. And I know I said a lot when it's supposed to only talk about a small piece, but I like to talk. So.
Well, I can give a little history on how what the site is used for and how it got here, and I think that might be helpful. So the site itself is, so when Neil talked about there's some magic that happens in front of the S3 bucket, I believe there's an Nginx proxy that actually does some routing based on location, based on the URL parameters and patterns, because not everything is served out of S3. There are still live team sites. There are also other sites that are not part of the base VA domain that are subdomains that have to get routed across. So it's pretty wonky. And there's also a tick in government. There's a thing called the trusted information. No, trusted. It has to do with traffic.
Trust the internet connection.
Thank you, Elijah. I'm glad to see you're here. So the tick is a requirement for things going in and out of a government. So there's a lot of back and forth as to what needs to be where, especially in this case, because all the flat files that are in S3 are actually public and there's no personalized information there. But if you log in to VA.gov and you're interacting with a React app, you are likely talking to an API that is sitting in AWS, which then is talking internally to the VA. So there's a lot of like back and forth of routing of traffic that happens. And a lot of data goes back and forth across what is called a tick. So that way it can be verified and validated going in and out of the government.
The tick is mean.
Yeah. So the other piece here is, I know one of the questions that we were going to head towards is why is this architecture what it is? And I think that the reason that we started with this is back in the day, vets.gov was a Jekyll site. And there was a Rails backend for a small application that was the veterans looking up their GI benefits. So it was an application called the GI benefits tool. And that was the first live application that was on vets.gov. So we started a project that was a greenfield project back in 2015 as something that would allow, it was this aspirational place for veterans to track, manage, and apply for the benefits they had earned. So the first thing we did was the GI comparison tool, because even veterans didn't understand the benefit and how they were supposed to utilize it. So this was a really good visualization. And that led to the first, forms being brought over. So those forms were written in React and Redux. And we created, at the time, a node backend that could speak to a SOAP API that was submitted, that we were submitting these forms to. So that eventually standardized on Rails being what we used for the platform of all the APIs that existed. And in the front end, we had React and we required Webpack. And we had an engineer who absolutely did not like Ruby. So she thought it would be a good idea for us to move away from it and move over to Metalsmith. So we were just doing a static site build anyway. So we moved to a Metalsmith build script. And that is why we started with static site. Also because it made it easier for us to push flat files into S3. And it was a way to sort of get around an ATO. Right. So in government, when you have a contract and a project, you need it to go live. There's it's an authority to operate. You need to get approval and you have to go through a bunch of controls, security controls, validations that say you have been approved to do this. So if we were just pushing JavaScript and HTML files, that's a lot easier to get approved than us pushing a database up into production. So that is sort of why we are here. And then we created a contract to bring a content management system to the table after we did a brand merger of vets.gov into VA.gov. And that contract meant that we had to, now that we had this, we needed a way for content editorial to be done that didn't involve writing markdown files in a GitHub repository. So we couldn't scale that to the 1,000 end users because we really couldn't convince them to write Markdown. So we needed something that would work. So the solution at the time was an open source content management system would be utilized for an editorial workflow. So that is how Drupal ended up coming into the flow. And then the requirement was that we couldn't change the build system. So it had to then provide the data that was coming out of flat files to Drupal, to the build process. And we also had to support the existing build process. So the team sites had to continue to live. We had to start bringing data in from Drupal, and we had to modify the existing build process without, so talk about like, building the plane as you're flying it. We were like building the aircraft carrier with the plane inside of it and the car inside all at the same time. So that's a little history of how we got here.
It's crazy. So I don't know where to go from there. So
I can also double down on Neil's comment about contracts. I think the interesting thing here is, right, in government, you don't often say, I need all of this, or you're not aware that this is all going to be interconnected and required as one big solution. So it is easier to procure the pieces that you need. So you basically go out and say, like, I need a content management system. What you don't realize is you don't have VA.gov without the content management system now. So the build process is run by one contract. The platform team that runs the APIs is run by another contract. And then, so I've joked about this, and Elijah's heard me say this. It's like you built Conway's law into your contracting. Forget about your organization, right? Like, so we just mimicked exactly the edges of the contracts in the way these things interact with one another. So in order to troubleshoot something, you basically have to build a super triage team across all of your contracts and bring them into one group and say like, cool, this is how we solve problems now. We need all of your breaks.
And since we work in government, there's never any politics, political motivation. Anyways.
Right.
Can I ask a API question just on this terms of scale? I worked with the DOI and BLM and stuff for a while, and then I just came in and did a project with the VA for DOC, and that was the most APIs I'd ever seen. There were like, I think we had 15 between the different agencies that we were bouncing through. How many do you think you have at play? I mean,
so publicly there's Lighthouse, right? So you can go and actually look at the APIs that are available to the public. So if you just Google VA's Lighthouse, you'll see that there's a project that is bringing things from inside the VA to the outside world. Initially, it was done for things like Apple Health, so the veterans could bring their health data into Apple's apps. So that was one interesting early use case of it. But the reality is the VA is an ecosystem that is basically 3 agencies in one, right? If you think about it, it's an umbrella agency that has the health organization, the benefits organization, and the NCA, the cemeteries organization. So each one of those, it has their own undersecretaries. So they're all kind of separate, almost cabinet level agencies. So each one of them has separate solutions. So like e-benefits is still a solution that exists and lives out there under the benefits side of the house. My Healthy Vet lives out there under the VHA side of the house. And a lot of those actually have APIs that are available to them. So it's interesting, like the way that communication happens inside the VA is sometimes through like antiquated SOAP requests that are on these old systems, but then there are like modern plays of trying to make APIs out of them. And then sometimes it's now moving to this Lighthouse where you have the ability to like bring a non-modernized API up and out to the public by standardizing it through Lighthouse. So there are an amazing amount of interactions. Like there's a map of the VA systems that is known as Frankie, that is basically like a poster board, like a 6-foot poster board with 7-point font that has every system under the benefits side of the house. It is one of the scariest diagrams I've ever seen in my life. And that diagram was made in like 1999. So it's currently 22 years out of date. Like, but that is the most modern version of Frankie that I am aware of.
Yeah.
So
it's chaos. Yeah.
There's a good question here by Benji. How are you guys using Drupal for the project? And then following up with that is how are we using Tome in the project, and where are you in using Tome and integrating Tome? So
let me kind of give what we're at now. Steve's gonna be really good about answering how we're using Drupal and how what we're doing right there. Let me talk about the overall structure of how Drupal gets, how we use Tome and how that works together. And maybe that diagram was still useful. And I can bring up one
if you can walk us through that, dude.
Yeah, the diagram was useful. Let me walk you through it. So Drupal is our editorial experience where all content is published. And this is Elijah made this one. This is Elijah. He's on this call. He was the only person he was around.
Elijah, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. So
Drupal is our editorial experience. So Drupal, way Tome Sync works is it creates, a JSON file for every entity in your system to an extent. And it does the current revision. So you just do whatever entity load on an ID, and that's the entity it loads in. So it's published and unpublished content depending on the status. But it does it one for every type of entity, and there's all the relationships are done by UUID, and it's just everything you need to rebuild your database. It's really cool. What we were using it for is at this very moment, this is honestly, Tome Sync still isn't live, and we don't know, not because of Tome Sync, because of other factors within what we talked about the contract. It may not ever go live, to be honest. We're trying to figure that out like today and this week, So right now we have a Graph API call, that's the way data is pulled in. And I'm trying to find a good diagram. This is the proposed one. This is actually the overall process of how content gets built from the Jenkins job perspective. And this doesn't include any of the Drupal stuff. So this is just like the content. This is all the stuff that's not included in my contract. That's what everything downstream. The content that pulls right now, what it does now is it does a GraphQL request. And the GraphQL request it was making was one single request to pull all published content and all related content out of the system. So if you've used GraphQL, you can actually nest queries within each other and use filters. And so it was doing one query to pull all the data down. That query at this point, we have about 2,000-ish, 2,200 published nodes right now. That query takes about 15 to 20 minutes by itself, let alone any of the build process. 2 weeks ago, one of our coworkers from the front-end tools team, they refactored how GraphQL was called to call, now it calls much smaller requests, no more than 50 nodes at a time. So the build process went, the problem we're trying to solve with Tome Sync was getting content out of Drupal in a second or less, in a couple of seconds, right? Which is almost impossible, but just real quick. We were at 20 minutes before. Tome Sync representation. What it is all JSON files. The front end build makes a request to our code to fetch CMS and returns a tarball of all those files. So that tarball contains, and they have a process that goes through all those files, relates them together, and does the build. And that was our plan going forward. Drupal, we wouldn't have to hit the GraphQL API anymore. We could scale our editorial experience and have to worry about scaling the GraphQL experience. So that was the initial plan. What we might end up doing, and I say might because honestly this just changes all the time. Since now the GraphQL request went from taking 20 minutes to taking 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes now in its current state. This process doesn't always make sense. Now, has nothing to do with Tome. Tome has lived up to it. It's done everything it's needed to do. It's been flexible enough where I've been able to change the output of the JSON files to meet specific requirements for our front end build. I've been able to override classes. It's been great. The problem is turning that data into something usable by the templates. So what was happening is there was this layer, this data transformation layer. We call them transformers. So the data out of the Tome export was going from static JSON files, transform the data into something that's ingestible by the templates, and then the templates ingest it, then Metalsmith ingests that build layer into HTML.
And those templates are liquid templates. So
liquid templates, yeah.
Metalsmith build process, building files out and utilizing liquid to do that. So that was the original format that it was required to be in. So that's what the original GraphQL query was written against. So that was one of the transformations that had to happen going from GraphQL to just an example.
Yeah.
What has gone in there?
What they didn't want to do is rewrite the template layer. So they wanted the templates to use the same data. So we have something called a pages.json file, and that file is a single static representation of all the data in Drupal in a matter that's ingestible by Metalsmith. Okay, that's what that is. Creating that pages.json file, GraphQL versus Tome Sync. Tome Sync. Which one? I keep on changing it. I'm going to say it different every time just to bother Sam. No, I'm just kidding, Sam.
I don't mind at all. It's okay. I knew when I named it that would happen.
So that data transformation layer has proved to be much more complicated than we ever originally intentionally thought it would be. Because the data that's out, just think about it like a node load in Devel. That's the output of what Tome Sync puts in a static JSON file, which is perfect for very small files. It's perfect for what it is, right? But it doesn't work if you're trying to like query it, or if you're trying to turn it into lists of data somewhere else. So
think about entity references is where the real hang up is. And the Tome export just has an entity ID to go get this other paragraph. And they were having to come up with a logic to actually go find that paragraph in the Tome export convert that, follow any other. I mean, we have a lot of entity references, so it's like spiders out and trying to trace out all the entity references from just JSON files was kind of consuming.
Yeah, and then turning those into lists. So we had different relationship between different types of entities to make lists. Our data structure is pretty complicated. So remember where, and Steve, I might want to have to talk to you about how we're onboarding different users, the different kind of cohorts they're in, and how different they all are to work. Because our goal is to get one system, one level of governance, one platform, one VA, right? So that's the idea behind this. But it's not. It's tough to do it at the end of reality. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about what we're using Drupal for on that side of the house?
I think that's almost too much to cover here. I would probably focus on what we're doing with Tome and the challenges of
Okay.
trying to get content out to the front, and then how they're building it in, those kind of things.
Yeah, so I mean, I was going to answer some Benji's questions about some of the things we're using Drupal for. Yeah, a lot of indie reference, a lot of paragraphs, lots of paragraphs. We have the menu structures all in Drupal, and the breadcrumb generation is done based upon Drupal's breadcrumbs. They have taxonomy. We use Workbench access to allow certain users access to certain contents. We call them sections of content done by taxonomy. So that's all in Drupal. None of that matters when we export it, because we're not exporting any user. It's all anonymous data, right? So we don't care about that. JQ is actually used in our debugging a lot. We use it a lot to define certain fields. And the problem necessarily isn't just the references. It's also validating the data structure itself. So the GraphQL, you actually select what fields you want, and it's output in a certain way. And the way the serializer and normalizer that Drupal uses, so it's like Tome Sync just uses the plain built-in Drupal normalizes and serializes. It can override a couple pieces, and I've override a couple more pieces, which is actually the great part about it. Like, I don't know if you know much about Drupal serializer and normalizer. So the serializer just turns data into a different format. So from the array to JSON, basically static JSON string, and the normalizers take an object, an entity in any case, and turn it into like an array to use. Basically, it's kind of oversimplified, but that's what it does. And you can override any fields you want as far as the normalizing any field type, and so it's been allowed us to change the structure the data gets output. But that structure is very Drupal centric. You have your process field, like your input formats, like all this stuff, NIDs, and all it's very Drupal centric. And GraphQL query is very front end, is very query centric, where it's formatted the way the person pulling it wants it. So transferring from a Drupal centric to a non-Drupal centric, I don't know if anybody ever seen the Drupal data model or trying to do something. It was way too much big of an effort. The fields have different meanings, and a big problem is no one trusted the data transformation layer. No one trusts it, because to validate that we're going to still output the HTML still validated, and we have thousands of pages on the website, no one's going to check one individually. We don't really have an automated tool set to really do the diffs like I saw earlier today. So, it's yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say, the other thing that's kind of bogged this down is the idea that we were switching from GraphQL to using Tome for the whole site all at once. So it became, as soon as that decision was made off of our team, to be waterfall, this whole thing became enormous. Instead of just saying, all right, we have this events content, let's transform that, let's convert that to using the Tome method and get that out the door and published. That approach really wasn't taken. It was, let's run everything through Tome and try to transform everything, and it's kind of been crushing on the team that's trying to do that. So they really kind of deviated from an Agile approach and went waterfall, and it's was up until a couple of weeks ago very biting at them for that reason.
Can we have Sam talk about what the Tome approach is? Like how do you guys use Tome, and what the Tome approach is, and how should you use Tome?
Should we? Sorry, that was funny.
Yeah. I'll try to make the summary quick, but yeah, we've said like Tome a few times, but haven't dived into like what it is. So
Right.
just really quickly, it's a Drupal module that you can get from Drupal.org. It's Tome, and yeah, it basically the reason I made it is because I wanted to generate a static site with Drupal. So that's like first thing, most important. I wanted a static site from Drupal. The other thing is that I realized that Drupal is really different from other static site generators, which store the code for like your front end and the content in a repository. So like if you have a Jekyll site, you literally write your like theme, your Jekyll theme, and you write Markdown in the same place. That's not the case with Drupal. You have like a server, you have people logging into it. The static site generator would probably have to live somewhere else and do API calls. And so I realized there was kind of like two needs. One was just generating static HTML from Drupal. So kind of like if you're running wget recursive, but very, very smart and much, much faster. So that half is called Tome Static. So that's a submodule you can turn on right now and generate a static site for most Drupal sites. And then the other half, which we've talked about here, is Tome Sync. And what that does is addresses this like content and code thing that other static site generators have, where every time you edit content, which is an entity in Drupal, it'll export to this JSON file. And then you can actually like turn off your Drupal server, you can dump your database, you can commit the export, and then later on you can rebuild your site, which would be insane for VA.gov because you have like thousands of concurrent editors, but it actually makes sense for really small sites because why do you want to pay Acquia or Pantheon, you know, however much a month to host a site that's edited once a month or even once a week? If all of your content is going to be cached anyway, you're basically paying for like a PHP process that's running idle maybe like 99% of the time. So yeah, so that's my summary of Tome. So it's kind of a tricky module, but it has two halves. The key thing, which ties back to VA.gov, is that the Tome Sync half only exists to like store content in code. Like that's its only purpose. It was not originally written to be consumed to use other static site generators, but even I've done those sort of tests with Gatsby.js, and it's possible. I mean, obviously VA.gov has been trying to, but yeah, I mean, the format is literally a serialization format just to rebuild Drupal. It's like machine food. It's never really meant to be used by humans. So that's kind of where, you know, your struggle has come in, where, you know, if we modified Tome Sync at its core to be really friendly to people using other static site generators, it may start like breaking in terrible, scary ways for people that are rebuilding their site from these exports. So that's kind of the conflict between these two halves. Yep.
So what one of the things that Tome offered for us is with a query that takes 20 minutes and 1,000 editors, we have all these possibilities for race conditions, where we have, you know, something in that query is generating a list of events, and something in that query is also generating the events as pages. And it's very easy for the events list to end up, if it's getting built late in the query. So the events are all created, and then the event list is created, but somebody's added an event that now shows up in that list that doesn't exist as an event, right? We end up with all these kinds of race conditions. So one of the nice things with Tome is that when they would pull down the tar of all the Tome files, they were absolutely in sync. There were no race conditions, and they could process all of those without any sort of fear of race conditions, where with the GraphQL query that took 20 minutes, like literally they happened in sequence. And so,
yeah.
And when it starts spanning 20, you know, a race condition possibility when there's a minute time window is not a big deal. A race condition possibility when you have a 20-minute window gets pretty severe when you're talking about scaling up to the number of editors that we were going to be.
How do you not get race condition with Tome? Or why do you not?
Because
get?
it's immediate. As soon as you save a node, it becomes part of that exported files. And so, and we're not saving any views or anything like that. They're actually generating the list of events from all of that content that's in Tome. So it literally is a snapshot in time of your data at the instant that they requested it.
And data is always changing during the GraphQL requests, like the way I put the link to the GraphQL request, the one big one that was made, the 20-minute one. I put a link to the actual raw request that gets made. And you can see how big just the request, let alone the response, is ridiculous. And how to, like, if you want, like, you can't really call this because you don't have access to these servers, but you know how we call it, how we test it, and the way the fragments are done, they're done in such small parts where GraphQL processes one fragment at a time, and so it'll run a query against a table for a list of items, and then for like you get build out individual pages, right? So you want an individual list of events. Then later on the query, they'll request the same list again, but with different fields. So it's a shorter list. So redoing that query again, doing another query, not reusing the same query, doing another query, new events have been added. So that's the race conditions he was talking about. During the request, people are adding events to a listing. And that can be fixed by changing the order of events. It can be fixed by fixing the GraphQL, which is what we're doing now. And this is when we're talking about the contract border thing. The generation of this query, I have little to no control over. Right,
because it's an API somebody else is using.
Somebody else is using our API. So while we've asked them a number of times to make smaller requests, it hasn't been thought as possible until recently. So it's one of those things where one of the engineers over that team says, you know what, this has been bothering me for a long time. I'm just going to do it. So he spent like a weekend and did it. So like, it took him 3 days to something that people wouldn't do in 2 years because he was like, he just felt it was wrong and did the right thing. So that's you hear sometimes that happens. It doesn't generally happen very often in the line of the work that we're in government work, because we're part of like a special special bubble within the government that allow it to be more agile than traditional. You think of government work as really slow and process oriented. We're allowed to be a little more agile because we're under a certain little umbrella. Our contract's different. It's all about the contract.
Well, I just want to take it back to Benji's initial question: is how is Drupal helping this? So there's a highly customized editorial workflow that has the ability to be broken down by like regions in the VA. Because every single hospital subsystem has different people who are responsible for their content, and they have to be able to control what that site looks like based on a product that is a VHA location. So that is what Drupal is really doing for the world that is the Department of Veterans Affairs. It is allowing them to create a highly customized, scalable editorial system that has a workflow built into it that also supports things like alerts and interacting with tons of APIs to pull data together to make it usable by veterans. So like the end user of the CMS is VA employees. The end user of the output of VA.gov is everybody. Right? It's veterans, it's caretakers, it's family members. So in this case, what Drupal is doing is making it possible for, as of right now, about 1,000 editors to be able to edit a single giant website. And it is all sort of protected based on their permissions and who they are and where they are and all of that. And I just pulled mine out. I still have it. Don't tell anybody. I still have my PIV card, which I was supposed to give back, but it was right at the beginning of the pandemic and I didn't. So one of the other nice things that this version of Drupal, this instance of Drupal is using is you can use your PIV card to log in, which is a personal identification card. And that was huge, right? Because this meant that they didn't have to do anything else with permissions. We could validate a person based on the ID card that they're given when they work for the VA. So this is super important in this environment. And that was an early project that I don't think Steve worked on. I think that might have even predated you, Steve. Yeah, there was some really craziness that went into how do we make this work inside. And it also meant that we didn't ever have to put user accounts into production because the editing is happening internally before the static site is being generated. So it solved a couple of problems all at once.
Yeah, so the next, I was actually going to ask what the editing workflow is and what the DevOps consequences are for that editing workflow. So,
get him, Steve.
Well, the editing workflow is a little bit hard because they can't preview they can preview it in node view, but it's not an accurate representation of what's actually being done on the front end. So they make their changes in a, edit a node like any editor might do in Drupal. And we're, using workflows. So they're changing it to our moderation state. So when they change it to published, it becomes available now through GraphQL because they're only querying things that are published, or it becomes available through the Tome export. And then the front end when I started, it was only once a day they were rebuilding the front end of the website. So an editor could edit something at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's not going to go live until 2 o'clock the next day, right? They'd have to wait almost 24 hours, depending on when they were editing it, to see that change actually get published.
And how often is it happening now?
Well, it still only happens once a day automatically, but we've built in some triggers within Drupal where they can request a content release, which is essentially a front end build, and we kick off a Jenkins job, and it does, and it goes and builds the front end. To further complicate things, there's a front end tool that scans the entire website for broken links. If it finds a broken link across thousands of pages, it will call the whole thing off. And so there are ramifications to that when, say, for instance, there's a hurricane coming towards Puerto Rico, and the facilities are trying to announce that, hey, we're going to close, and they can't get that message out because there's some broken link someplace. So there's a lot of ramifications to these things that we built some tools to try to solve.
Yeah. I also just want to say the reason is, right, when you heard me describe what vets.gov was, it was track, manage, and apply. It was not learn stuff, go find stuff out. It was literally action-oriented things. That's why content only deployed once a day, because there was no new content really, right? So that was what it was. We optimized for the ability to automatically deploy new features daily in the case of like logged in users. So that was very different than having giant content repository of data going live all the time. So the use case of vets.gov versus what VA.gov are significantly different. And this is still sort of backed into the build system and process that was created by the vets.gov team initially.
We have initiative to currently make it an hour is the next goal. I think by April, we'll have an hour. But the really goal is the 1 minute, right? And like Robbie said, that the current process isn't. We need to get down to where we're publishing one page at a time, not a whole site at a time. There's all these problems we need to solve that are very complicated. That the next year or so we have to get on to wake, or else our site's not gonna scale, right? It's kind of a scary time coming for me, as we're quite in the middle now of understanding our capabilities and limits of our build system and our Drupal system in general, and where infrastructure is going to blow up, and you hit these random limits, not just like, I'm not just talking like memory or timeout limits, but like some MySQL query size limits. So we ran into our queries for MySQL were too large, so we started getting these random errors in MySQL we had to go figure out. So we have high CPU usage, we had to figure out what query. So I mean, all these normal things you have scaled really high, and we have a very small team. Like we have 2 dedicated DevOps people, Elijah and Eric, who's on the call, and we have 6 engineers over the 2 teams, 6, right? Yeah. And we have 2 product managers, 2 account managers, and there's a design team. So like that team is managing the CMS for thousands of editors. So understanding like it's very difficult for us, as we're at this point, understanding where our limits are going to be and what we need to prioritize to do next. We're all doing everything at the same time right now. So some initiatives are happening where we're going to understand, I'm kind of veering off a little bit, but we're going to understand where limits in our build system are. Can we publish 100,000 nodes in an hour? Because that's a question. We don't know if we can at this point. So, which is scary, because we're going to have 100,000 nodes in our, I mean, it's not a lot of nodes, it really isn't, but we're going to have that many nodes in our system, in a few months, like we know we are. So it's 6 to 8 months at most. So we don't know whether or not, it could take an hour to publish that, right? I think that's kind of an unacceptable point, in my opinion. So a lot of things happening for us right now in that state.
And then this is where you're saying that if you were to go with Tome, it speeds up the whole process of publishing.
Yeah.
Well,
So
sorry.
No, what Tome does is it pushes the problem somewhere else. So it moves the query, that 20-minute query. So we can't. Oh, I did some analysis on data from the old GraphQL before we did the GraphQL refactor. We were hitting the 1 hour timeout, which is a 4,000 second timeout. AWS, ALBs have a 4,000 second limit in the timeout you're allowed to have. We're hitting that timeout with around 8,000, 9,000 nodes in our system because of the way the query was generated. Okay, 1 hour to make that's just one step of a 29-step build process, which then has that's one step within a Jenkins process. So that alone was an hour at 8,000 nodes. This is what I'm talking about. Why I was starting to get scared. What Tome did is the Drupal part, it took that hour down to a second. Honestly, less than a second.
Because we pre-cached it, basically. We did on every deploy, we would export it because schema changes and things like that. So that only took a few minutes. And then I will highlight too that when the request comes in, we real-time tar it. So that only takes a second on a fast SSD. It's pretty crazy. Less than a second.
Elijah, what was the thing that you had found when you did your initial pass? We were talking about tarring it and then zipping it, and it took longer to way longer to compress it than it did to just send it at full size. Do you want to describe? Because I think that was such an interesting find and description of why, if you understand HTTP as a protocol, you can win in AWS land. This was really awesome.
So we had the entire Tome export, 20,000. This is my benchmark, 20,000 JSON files. And because you're in a fast data center with a 3 gigabit per second connection, it's a big file eventually. But compressing that tarring then compressing actually took like 10-15 seconds. But if we just tarred it, which is basically just a wrapper around file pointers, I think, I'm not that sure, but it was like literally a half second, and then the actual transfer from the CMS to the Jenkins was only another second or so, even though it was multiple megabytes. So you have an overall, like, it was just tarring was way faster than compressing and sending on, even though you'd save some data with compression.
So there was like data analysis on every step of the process that Elijah was able to work with, which is really neat, right? Like the assumption was it would be faster if we made this file smaller by compressing it and then pushing it across to another server. The reality was HTTP, as you push large files, will increase the amount of bandwidth available on a single transaction. So it starts off at 100 megabits and then will scale upwards if the file
start.
So that means that you get this like unbelievable ability to push a large file and then at the other side just rip the wrapper open is really what it came down to, as opposed to taking the time to compress it all the way down.
Oh, interesting.
One thing I was going to say to just further complicating your potential future use of Tome, because I want to be not helpful, is one thing you can do with Tome Sync and consuming it with other static site generators is that because everything is split into files, you also have that file modification time if you like persist that somehow. So what's cool about that, like for instance, if you use Gatsby.js with a Tome Sync export, you can like run Gatsby.js watch and watch the file directory, and it will just rebuild its whatever internal representation of all the JSON based on when the files are touched. So there's added benefits that it's not quite caching, but it's kind of like that. But there's added benefits because it's files, because you can do things like, hash all the file contents and have a list of hashes somewhere. You can look at file modified time. You have like all of these things where you don't actually have to parse the JSON. You can just like inspect the file. I don't know. So that's a potential other way to use it.
We were actually using the hashing of the tar to figure out whether or not we should do a builder at all.
Awesome.
So that was a new feature they were adding in the build process to help save time.
Oh, there's also just one Tome question, kind of. One person asked if you can re-import the site from Tome Sync. Yep, that's how it works. So like, I would say most Tome users are doing that. So they like turn off Drupal unless they're actively editing it, and then some CI process, or maybe their local builds HTML. And then James also asked about how binary assets work in Tome. With Tome Sync, it just saves the like original raw file, because during the Tome static build, it'll do things like image styles and derivatives and all of this stuff. So it just stores the raw file, which is tricky in Git. So there's a thing called Git LFS where you can store large files without like the overhead of having them in your history kind of forever. So that's a way you can work around the weirdness of storing like, 1,000 large files in Git. Yep.
I just want to shine a spotlight. There's a lot of amazing work that is being done by the humans that you've heard speaking about this today, right? This is all being done to try to help veterans. So I just want to remind everybody, like, there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of MVP work that was done here that eventually became production. But the reality is these people that you're hearing today are actually doing the work of helping veterans get access to content, to benefits, to services. And Drupal is a part of that. It's not maybe the perfect solution right now, but I think the reality is it is effectively supporting the entire veteran service member family community and allowed us to move into a more modern workflow, which I think is super important.
And the front end and back end CMS are fully open source. Anybody in the world can spin up the CMS with a working sanitized database dump and tinker with it.
Yeah, I put the links earlier into the chat, but we should definitely make sure people have them.
Yeah,
that's incredible. It's really cool.
Well, thanks, you guys. I know we went a little bit over time, and but this was an amazing session, and thank you, Sam and Robbie, Neil, Elijah, and Steve. So this is great. So thank you guys for being here.
Happy to be here. And honestly, if people have further questions, I'm Robbie the Geek everywhere online. Feel free to ping me. I know way too much about this. Like, I've forgotten other things from my childhood because of the amount of crap I have in my head about VA.gov. So feel free to ping me.
Yeah, this is a great session. So thank you guys very much. This is awesome.